Imagine you wanted to buy something like a toy or a video game, but you didn't have enough money. You might borrow money from your friend or family to buy it, promising to pay them back later. The US government does something very similar. When the US needs money to pay for things like schools, roads, or the military and doesn't have enough money, it borrows money. And that is what is called government debt. When the government borrows money, it does this by issuing something called bonds. A bond is like an IOU. It's a promise to pay back the money later with interest. People and other countries buy these bonds, giving the US government money now. And in return, the US promises to pay them back later with a little extra money. Why does the US borrow money? The US borrow money to cover its spending needs. For example, the government needs to pay for healthcare, defense, education, infrastructure, and social programs. Sometimes the government doesn't have enough tax money to cover all of this, so it borrows the difference. What happens when the US borrows more than it pays back? Over time, the amount of money the US government owes grows bigger. This is called national debt. Right now, the US has trillions of dollars in debt. When the debt grows too much, it can be hard for the government to pay back all of the money it owes, and the US might need to borrow even more. How debt affects the economy? The US government has a debt ceiling. This is a limit on how much money the US can borrow. If the US government reaches this limit and cannot borrow more money, it might not be able to pay for everything it needs. The government will have to find other ways to pay its bills, which could hurt things like social programs, government services, and even jobs. Why don't we just pay off the debt? The US could try to pay off its debt faster, but that will mean the government will have to raise more money by collecting more taxes or cut spending on things like schools and roads. It's a difficult choice. Paying off debt is important, but it's also important to keep the economy running smoothly. What is dollarization? The US dollar is the money used in the United States, but it's not just used in the US. Many countries around the world use the dollar too. Some countries use the US dollar as the main currency, while others just use it for trade. Countries that trust the US dollar because it's stable and strong. What does it mean if the world stops using the dollar? Dollarization refers to countries deciding to stop using the US dollar. This means that instead of using the dollar for trade or savings, countries might choose to use their own currency or another currency like the euro. Why would countries want to stop using the dollar? Countries might decide to stop using the dollar for different reasons. Some might think that they could have more control over their own economies by using their own monies. Others might not like being dependent on the US for trade. If countries believe the US might not be able to pay back its debt or that the dollar might lose its value, they may look for alternatives. What happens if China, Japan, and other countries stop using the dollar? China, Japan, and South Korea are big economies in the world, and they trade a lot with the US. Right now, these countries use the US dollar for some of their international trade. But if they stop using the dollar and use their own currency instead, it will have big effect on the US economy. Let's talk more. There will be less demand for the dollar. If countries like China and Japan stop using the dollar, there will be less demand for it. That means the US might have to find ways to get people to keep buying its bonds and help pay off the debt. The US might not be able to borrow money as easily, which could make things like paying for schools or roads harder. If the US isn't used as much in trade, the value of the dollar might go down. This means it will be worth less than it is now. When the value of the dollar goes down, things like gas, food, and toys will become more expensive in the US. A weak dollar is not good. It can lead to inflation, which means that prices for goods and services go up. This will make everyday things like shopping more expensive for Americans. If inflation goes too high, it can make it harder for people to afford things they need. The US has a lot of influence in the world because many countries use the dollar. If countries stop using the dollar, the US might lose some of its influence and power in global trade and finance. This could make it harder for the US to make deals with other countries or maintain its position in the world economy. Currently, there has been a trend where some countries are starting to use other currencies instead of the US dollar. China and Russia, for example, have been talking about trading in their own currency rather than using the dollar. Other countries in Asia and Africa have also been exploring alternatives. The US dollar is still the most widely used currency in the world, but this trend is something to keep an eye on. If more countries decide to stop using the dollar, it could make things more difficult for the US. So, what can the US do to prevent de-dollarization? One way the US can prevent the dollar from losing its value is by making sure its economy stays strong. This means creating jobs, improving infrastructure, and keeping inflation low. When the US economy is strong, people and countries are more likely to keep using the dollar. Paying off the debt. Another way to keep the dollar strong is by working on reducing the national debt. Currently, it's in the trillions. If the US can prove that it can pay back the money it owes, people might trust the dollar more. This could help keep demand for the dollar high and avoid inflation. What is the US Treasury bills? A US Treasury bill is a type of bond issued by the US government. When the US government needs money, instead of printing more dollars or just borrowing more from banks, it sells these treasury bills to other countries, companies, and to investors. A T-bill is a promise from the US government to pay back the money after a certain amount of time, along with a little extra, that is interest. They are short-term loans. The government says, give us money now and we'll pay you back in a few months or a year. Why do countries buy US Treasury bills? The US government is very unlikely to run out of money or default because of safety and stability and the trust that the people across the world have on US. The US is considered one of the most stable countries in the world, so buying T-bills as seen is safe. Countries want to invest their money in something that is guaranteed to return their money safely, and the US has a long history of being reliable. T-bills offer a little bit of interest. Even though it's not huge, it's still a safe way to make some money. Countries like China, Japan, or other large economies have a lot of money they need to invest. They don't want to just keep it sitting around, so buying T-bills allow them to earn a small return on their money while keeping it safe. Dollar reserves. Many countries use the US dollar as reserve currency. A reserve currency is a currency that countries hold in large amount as part of their financial reserves. The US dollar is the mostly widely used and trusted currency in the world. By buying T-bills, countries are effectively holding on to more US dollars. This helps them manage their own currency and trade internationally because the US dollar is needed in a lot of global trade. Trade surpluses. Countries like China and Japan often have trade surpluses. This means they sell more goods to other countries and they buy. As a result, they earn a lot of US dollars. Instead of keeping all those dollars in cash, they can invest them in T-bills. It's a way for them to use those dollars without just holding on to them and letting them lose value over time. Currency stability. Holding US Treasury bills helps other countries keep their own currencies stable. For example, China and Japan want their currency to be strong enough so their goods can stay competitive in global markets. By buying US T-bills, these countries help stabilize the value of the US dollar and in turn help keep their own currency stable. It's part of delicate balance between global currency. Liquidity. T-bills are very liquid. This means they can be easily turned into cash. If a country or a bank needs money quickly, they can sell their T-bills on their market at any time. This makes T-bills a very flexible investment because countries can get their money back wherever they need it. Why is this good for the United States of America? It helps fund the government. The US government uses the money from selling T-bills to pay for things like schools, road, healthcare, and military. This allows the US to keep running and paying for important services without needing to raise taxes all the time. When countries buy lots of T-bills, the demand for those T-bills goes up. As a result, the US can borrow money at a lower interest rate. This helps the US save money on the cost of borrowing. Lower interest rates also means people in the US can borrow money for things like homes, cars at a cheaper rate, thus keeping the interest rates low. So, what is United States government debt? A US government debt refers to the total amount of money the US government owes to creditors. When the US government spends more money than it collects through taxes and other sources of revenue, it borrows the differences. It borrows the money by selling government bonds and treasury bills to investors, including people, companies, and foreign governments. These bonds and bills are promises that the government will pay you back the money with interest after a certain period. You can think of it like when someone borrows money from a bank to buy a house. The bank lends the money now and the person promises to pay it back over time with interest. Similarly, the US borrows money now through bonds and treasury bills and promises to pay it back later with interest. So, how does it US borrow money? So, the US government borrows money by issuing debt instrument primarily in the form of treasury bonds, treasury notes, treasury bills, and saving bonds. When people, banks, or foreign countries buy these bonds and bills, they are effectively lending money to the US government. The government agrees to pay back the amount borrowed with interest at a later time. So why does the US have government debt? The US government borrows money to fund things it needs to pay for such as social programs like Social Security, healthcare, and employment benefits. Defense and military. The US spends a lot on national defense and military operation. Building infrastructure like maintaining roads, bridges, building transportation. Education, funding public schools, university, and research. Interest on debt. The government also has to pay interest on the money it has already borrowed. The government borrows money when it spends more than it collects in taxes. For example, during the times of war or economic crisis like the year 2008 financial crisis or during the COVID-19 pandemic, the government may need to spend a lot more than usual to help the economy recover, leading to an increase in borrowing. So, what is national debt? A national debt is the total amount of money the US owes. It is the sum of all the past deficits when and it constantly changing as the government borrows and repay money. So there are two types of debt: public debt and intergovernment debt. So how much debt does the US have? As of now, the US government debt is in the trillions of dollars. The US government debt has been growing steadily over the years. It increases when the government borrows more money to cover budget deficit and slow down when there is a surplus when the government takes in more money than it spends. To understand how much debt the US has, let's compare it to something simpler. Imagine you earn $100 each month, but you spend 120. You borrow $20 to cover the extra cost. Over time, you keep borrowing a little more each month to cover your expenses. The total amount you owe will be like a national debt, and it will keep growing if you didn't pay back your loans. How does US government debt affect the economy? Government debt can affect the economy in several ways. 1. The US has to pay interest on the debt. This means that a significant portion of the government spending goes towards paying off the interest. The more debt the US has, the more money it needs to spend on interest, which could take away money from other programs. The more debt the government has, the more investors may demand higher interest rates to lend the government money. If the government has too much debt, it might become more expensive for it to borrow money in the future. Economic growth. Some argue that high level of debt can slow economic growth. If the government is spending a lot on interest payment, it might have less money to invest in things like education, infrastructure, or healthcare. But other people argue that borrowing is necessary for times of economic trouble, like during recession when the government needs to stimulate the economy by spending money. Confidence in the dollar. The US dollar is used around the world as a key currency, and investors trust that the US will pay back its debt. If the debt gets too high, people might start to worry that the US won't be able to pay it back. This could make the US dollar less valuable and could cause problems in international trade. So, what happens if the US can't pay its debt? The US is very unlikely to completely fail to pay its debt because it has a very strong economy and can print money to pay its bills if necessary. However, if the US government didn't pay back its debt, it could cause the following: loss of credibility. Countries and investors may stop buying US bonds and treasury bills, and the US could have trouble borrowing money in the future. It will weaken the dollar. A failure to pay debt could lead to the value of the US dollar dropping, which could make imported goods more expensive and lead to inflation. Raising of borrowing costs. If investors are worried about the US paying its debt, they might demand higher interest rates for lending money to the government, making borrowing more expensive. In short, while it's very unlikely that the US will default on its debt, managing the debt carefully is important to avoid negative consequences. Can the US pay off its debt? The US government doesn't need to pay off its debt all at once. It can borrow money and roll over the debt by issuing new bonds to pay back old ones. The US has the ability to manage its debt because it has a strong economy and the ability to borrow its own currency, the dollar. However, it's still important for the US to control the growth of its debt to ensure that it doesn't become a major problem. Keeping the debt at manageable levels helps avoid higher interest rates and keeps the economy healthy. In conclusion, US government debt is the total amount of money the government owes to others. It borrows money by selling bonds and bills, and it uses that money to pay for important things like defense, social programs, and infrastructure. While the debt is large, the US government can manage it because it has a strong economy and the ability to borrow in dollars. However, the government needs to be careful to make sure the debt doesn't get out of hand, as it could lead to higher interest costs and other economic problems. So the US government borrows money to pay for things it needs, which creates debt. This debt is paid back over time with interest, but if the debt becomes too big, it can cause problems for the economy. The US dollar is very important because many countries use it for trade, but if countries decide to stop using the dollar, it could make the US economy weaker and cause inflation. Right now, some countries are exploring alternatives to the US dollar, but the dollar is still the most widely used currency in the world. To protect the economy, the US needs to make sure it is managing its debt, keeping inflation low, and maintaining a strong economy. Guys, thank you for watching, and please don't forget to subscribe.